and we'll be going through some basic network troubleshooting stuff in both Windows and Unix and Linux-based operating systems. So first thing we'll be talking about is protocol analyzers. Talk about those some. Be going over traceroute a little bit, ARP stuff, just a hair, nbstat, netstat, and TCP dump. So some of the stuff we skipped in this chapter, like telnet troubleshooting. Why would we skip telnet troubleshooting? Yeah, why would you use telnet? You know, I mean, that's kind of a silly thing. You know, it's 2021. You shouldn't be using something unencrypted to manage your, say, routers and switches. Does that make sense? That's just asking for trouble. So, packet analyzer, or protocol analyzer rather, more commonly referred to as a packet sniffer. So basically what this allows you to do, it's on your network, it's going to basically listen, and I don't mean physically listen, I mean, you know, basically record every packet. It's going to give you the protocol, it's going to give you the destination, source, host, and it's going to tell you what the packet says if it's unencrypted. Now if it's encrypted, it'll still tell you what it says. It won't be very readable now, will it? So, you know, I encourage you to run one of these at some point. Great example of this would be something like Wireshark. Now, when I say run one of these, I don't mean run it on a corporate network. I mean run it on a network you own and control, so your home network. I imagine that the networking team around here wouldn't be too happy if I told you all to run a network analyzer on their network. So just don't do it. But yeah, like I said, it's going to show you pretty much everything going across the network. So pretty nifty. Okay, throughput testers. It's going to be very useful to troubleshoot speed issues. Okay, so let's say you're on a network and it's going very slowly. Okay, what's the first thing you're going to want to do? So if it's going slowly, it means it's going. So you don't have to worry too much about a physical connection, most likely. You're probably going to want to run some sort of throughput tester. You're going to test your speed, see how fast things are going. Got some examples up here. I like testmy.net if I'm on a mobile device because you don't have to download an app or anything. It's not some, you know, crazy thing where you have to download an app. I don't like downloading apps personally. Maybe you love downloading apps. You know, whatever. In basic terms, though, you get one that's installed locally. It should give you a lot more information than one that's over the internet, just, you know, on a server somewhere. So basically, you could test the speed between two different devices, two different hosts. And that could break it down by TCP and UDP. Now, here's a pop question. Which one of these is Chad? TCP or UDP? Okay, UDP. Okay. TCP obviously has a lot more verification and stuff in it. Now, we talked about which is better for which. I'm not going to go over that again. But it could be such that you have a high UDP speed but a low TCP speed. What could that indicate? Okay, could that be indicative of potential problems with you know, intermittent packet loss, for instance? So if UDP is fast and TCP is slow, yeah, it means there's probably some sort of strange issue happening. Okay, same thing with jitter. You know, jitter is going to say the distance between packets. How much does that change, or the time rather? And then ping, of course, is how long to receive a response from whatever you pinged. So pretty straightforward there. So we have traceroute. I've got the Windows functions here for Windows users. I'm a Windows user sometimes. So ignore my little laughing emoji there. It's trace RT in Windows. Why is it not traceroute? I really don't know, but it's not. Okay, and what this is going to do, so if you were to run this, it's going to tell you where exactly your packets were sent. So you can see here I ran this, and you know, I'd encourage you to run it if you're following along. Just do a trace route to somewhere and see it for yourself. Okay, so you can tell this is me going out to the router that I have. The router's connecting to the modem, and then it's going out to the internet. You know, and basically it ends up eventually at Google. Okay, 64 milliseconds, not the fastest connection in the world, is it? Okay? Someone tell me what you get when you do it here. So I'll give you guys a second to do that, and then we'll come back to it. Okay, another important thing to know is ifconfig, or in Windows, it's ipconfig. This is going to give you information about your network. It's going to tell you lots of different things about it. Of note on there, it's going to tell you your default gateway. It's going to tell you your subnet mask. It's going to tell you your IP address. It also tells you your external IP address. So lots of good information there. In addition, if you're on Windows and you use /all, it's going to tell you not just what you're actively using, but it's going to tell you all of your network connections. So, for instance, let's say that you have a laptop. Okay. Most likely, you're going to have multiple network interface cards in that laptop, right? Okay, if it's from the past, let's say, 20 years. Okay. Probably have a wireless network interface card. Probably have a wired network interface card. That may be debatable, though, on some modern devices, whether or not it has at least a dedicated wired network interface card. But in general, it's going to have two. And you could also make an argument whether or not a Thunderbolt controller would act as a wired internet controller. I'm not going to go into that argument, but it could act as one. Okay, so that's going to tell you all the information there. And if you were so inclined on Windows, you could renew your DHCP lease by using ipconfig /renew. You could certainly do that. And in general, I say just restart a computer. It'll do all this for you, but you could manually do it as well. Okay. Any questions about ifconfig? So, we ran traceroute. What speeds did you get? 9 milliseconds. Quite a bit faster than me, isn't it? Yeah, how about that? I wish I had faster internet, but you guys didn't pay to hear me complain about internet. Okay, ping. So in general, ping's a simple thing. Okay, you ping something, it tells you how long you receive a response, or what that distance is in terms of time. Now, there's a lot more options. Okay, so in general, the ones I would recommend ping-t. Okay, what this -t does is it is an extended ping test. It's going to keep pinging until you tell it to stop. You tell it to stop by using Control Break or Control C, depending on which platform you're on, of course. Some other things of note, things like A, it's going to allow you to resolve addresses to hostname. That could be useful for troubleshooting at some point. The rest of this is stuff that you probably would never use, to be honest. I would only test you over -t and -a. Does that make sense? Okay, like I said, there's a lot of other stuff you could know, but personally, I don't think you'll ever use it. Even if you're a network administrator, I still think it's unlikely you'd ever use any of this stuff, because we'll talk about some built-in tools that you're a lot more likely to use than stuff like that. Okay, so we have DNS problems. We may want to use something like the nslookup. So not DNS lookup, just nslookup. And this is going to allow us to diagnose lots of different DNS problems. It's going to tell us what the DNS server is. Just pretty much that's what it does. Not a whole lot to say about it. Just a brief little function to try out. Nmap. So this is going to be external utility. And it's going to allow you to get a decent map of a network. Now, is it going to be topological? Probably not. Okay. But what this can do, it can scan ports. And again, this is one I don't recommend you run on the campus network here. Now, in the lab in there, it's totally fine to run it. Because in the lab, it's on a separate subnet and VLAN. Okay, you're not going to be touching anything on campus. Other than the stuff in that room, of course, but, blow that room, not physically blow it up, but, do whatever in that room, no big deal, okay? Nmap's one that could get you in a lot of trouble, though. Okay, so it's going to tell you information about what's on the devices, that are attached to the physical ports. It's going to tell you what ports are open. That's logical ports, of course. Lots of different things. So, in general, it's going to give you some sort of information like this. It's going to allow you to sort of see what is happening on the network. So like I said, we'll be doing a lot more of that in the security class next semester. I will actually be having a lab that does that sort of stuff. I'm just going to see what's available and open. Now, let's say that you are a network administrator. Should you have ports open? Why or why not? Should you have ports open? Yeah, certainly. I mean, you can't have a port closed. For example, could you have port 443 closed and do a lot of browsing? Obviously not. Okay? So, use common sense there. Now, here's another question talking about that. Let's say that you have port 443 open. Okay, and that's the only port you have open. Can other stuff happen other than web browsing? Why or why not? So basically what I'm asking is, can other stuff happen on a port other than its intended purpose? Is it possible? Yeah, it's possible. Okay, so let's say you were a network administrator and you didn't want that to happen. Okay, how could you do that? How could you prevent it? Specific technology we've talked about in here. So what type of firewall specifically? It's a technology on a firewall on a specific type of firewall. Starts with a D. Okay, here's another hint. It shares an acronym with dots per inch. So the acronym is DPI. What is it? Deep packet inspection, exactly. Okay, and that's on what type of firewall? So I always kind of make fun of it and say it's a marketing term, but it's not entirely just a marketing term. What type? Next generation firewall, layer 7 firewall. Okay, because it's application aware. So make sure that you understand that. Here's an easier question. When should you serve tofu turkey? Okay, only serve tofu turkey on Pranksgiving. All right. Hope I didn't offend anyone with that making fun of tofu. Anyway, route is going to allow us to determine the route of something. It's pretty straightforward there. And it's not just going to allow us to determine the route of something, it's going to allow us to determine the route of everything. Okay, so for all the interfaces, it's going to give you the routing table, basically. Really straightforward there. So You can add routes, of course, append to an existing routing table. You can clear everything. Lots of different options. In general, there's not a whole lot of reason to do this. Okay, because where would you more likely want to handle things? On a host device or on, say, a router? A router, exactly. It's going to be a lot easier to centrally manage. And, in general, it's a bad idea to do things locally. I'm not saying don't ever have stuff like group policy. I'm just saying, you want to be able to centrally manage everything. And, group policy is hardly infallible. It's pretty good, but it's not infallible. And I like to think that, if you're building out a robust corporate network, it should be relatively infallible. Okay? Let's say it's not infallible. What's going to happen? You can have lots of downtime. Probably going to have a substantial bit. Lots of problems you can run into if you don't have things managed appropriately. Okay, nbstat. It's going to be for netbios, and this is a Windows-only thing. Again, this is one that I don't think you'd use too often. Maybe you would, but I've never used it in my life, and I don't think that I'm missing too much. But maybe it's one you use every day. Who knows? But basically, it's going to show the statistics. NetBIOS, of course, is going to be Windows technology to sort of help with the TCP/IP stack. So just a basic component there. And what this does is just takes a look at the interface and it says what's going across it. So are there better ways to do this? Okay. Yeah, absolutely. First of all, why would you need to see what's going across a particular host device on the host device? Why not look on the router? Yeah, it's on the router too. Why not look at 1,000 other places other than the host device? Does that make sense? So, just think about it. If you have crazy amounts of network traffic going across the device, is there any need at all to examine the device for the networking part? I'm not talking about like malware or anything like that. Is there a need to examine the network itself on the device? I don't think there is. Okay? That's my opinion. Anyone disagree? Can you think of a single case where this would be used? Literally one. I can't either. Like I say, use your built-in tools from the router and from the switches. I would not rely on Windows to tell much of anything. That's just my opinion, though. Here's a bunch of different options for the nbstat. I'm not going to have you memorize them. Again, I don't think nbstat's really that useful, to be honest. It's kind of cool, but it's not that cool. Does that make sense? So, like I said, I'm of the opinion, don't rely on the operating system. I'm of the opinion rely on the router and maybe network controller too. Okay, netstat's pretty similar. Netstat is going to allow you to see what's going inbound and outbound on the TCP/IP stack. So really straightforward there. Here's all the different options for it. Make sure you know -A. It's going to display everything. That could be an important thing to see if you ever wanted to. Make sure you know -E. That's going to allow you to see the Ethernet statistics. And also make sure you understand -R. -R is going to show you the routing table. That one actually could be useful. Everything else, I wouldn't say it's completely useless. I would just say there's better ways to get the information. Does that make sense? Okay, so TCP dump. Now, I don't mean to dump on Windows too much today, but they kind of threw this one at me, didn't they? Okay, calling it TCP dump. Anyway, just a bad joke there. It's going to allow you to read packets. Okay, and these packets can be going across the network live. So this can act as a protocol analyzer, also referred to, of course, as packet sniffer. Or the packets could be stored locally. Now, why on earth would you store packets locally? Can anyone think of a good reason to store packets? I really can't. Maybe you have some good use cases for it. That's just my. Now, if you ever want to do like a testing lab, sure. Not like testing as in like a proctored testing lab. I'm talking just like if you wanted to have a home lab set up and you wanted to examine packets. Maybe it makes sense to store them. But for the most part, there's very few reasons to do that. Seriously, can anyone think of a single reason why you would store packets? I can think of reasons why you would archive stuff like websites, why you would archive maybe, whatever content, but the packets themselves, is there a single reason we'd want to store those? I can't think of any either. So, a couple different options to know. Basically, -I is going to give you all of the traffic, and then you can specify the interface. So if you use any, it's going to give you for all of the traffic for all interfaces. For example, if you use eth0, it's going to tell you that specific interface. Now, okay, here's an interesting thing to think about. Okay, so with this right here, if we're using any as a modifier, okay, sometimes we use /all. Sometimes we use -a. Is that a little bit tricky? Okay. So, that's a downside of Windows, is it not? Inconsistent with its syntax for this sort of stuff. And like I said, I don't have a great response to that. I just wanted to kind of point that out. It's important that you make sure you're getting your syntax correctly. And it varies by function. Okay? Now, who doesn't like that approach? Who wishes it were consistent? Okay? Few people. I would hope everyone hopes it's or wishes it were consistent. But it's not. Okay? This is any. Some of them are -a. Some of them are /a. Some of them are /all. Now, let's say you don't have network connection and you don't have any networking books and you forget which ones are which. Okay. Two things you can do. Someone tell me one of them. So, maybe /help, maybe / whatever. That could certainly work. What's the other way? How about you just try stuff, Try this with -a. See if that works. Maybe it will work. Maybe it won't work. And if it doesn't work, try something else. Okay? So, it's okay to try stuff. Does that make sense? I would never suggest against trying. Okay, so some other troubleshooting stuff to know. The most important one is use your built-in tools for the router and for switches, maybe even access points, wireless controllers. Use the built-in tools. Okay, it's going to be a lot more robust. They're made for enterprise users. You're not relying on some operating system to report accurate statistics. Because let's face it, does any operating system report accurate traffic statistics? No, they don't. Okay. Why not? Well, it's very difficult to, for one thing, on a device, but it's very easy for a router to do that. Okay, a router knows what's connected to it, does it not? It knows what IP addresses are using what. It knows the MAC addresses, at least of stuff that's actively having traffic pass across it. So, I'm always of the opinion, you don't rely on the operating system. Okay, you rely on dedicated networking hardware. It's going to be a lot more accurate, a lot easier to use as well. Okay, because how do you actually get that information from a host machine? Okay, two ways. What's one of them? If you're actually getting it off the host machine. So if I wanted to run, say, nvstat on a host machine, how do I do it? So go to the machine is one way. And if we do that, it means we're spending time to get there, right? And it means we're displacing someone from their, desk or whatever. That's wasting more time. What's the other way? So remote tools, whatever your organization uses. Maybe they use something like, there's a bunch of platforms they could use. Okay? Now, either one of those, what's the major downside? What's the first major downside? Okay, if I remote into a computer, can someone else use a computer at the same time? Okay, so with RDP, it literally kicks them off, right? Now, let's say that I'm using some remote tool, like, I don't know, let's just use BombGuard as an example. It's a commercially available remote support tool. Okay? It may not kick them off, but, you know, if I'm trying to do something and they're trying to do something, will that cause some problems? Yeah, obviously. Okay? So, it's one of the major reasons to not use a lot of this stuff locally. The other reason is because it's inaccurate. And it's just so much easier, so much quicker to do things centrally. Okay? But you may disagree. Okay? I'm not saying that, you know, there's always the right answer. I think there are very few cases, though, where you would not use it from the router. Let's say you're having some network connectivity issues on a wireless network. Okay? What are you going to want to troubleshoot? First things first, go to the wireless controller. Okay. So if you're on, say, let's just use Ubiquiti network, for instance. So their wireless platforms, of course, are on Unify. Okay. So you go to Unify controller, open it up, and see lots of different stuff. You see stuff like interference, see what channels it's on, see how congested the channels are, see access points that are near it. Okay, maybe you need to reduce the power of the access points some. Pull up your individual devices connected to the access point. See what their uptime is. See if they're having, you know, packet loss, that sort of stuff. You can see all of that from the network controller. Does that make sense? Okay. It could be that the access point is perfectly fine. Maybe the wireless network interface card is going bad. That's far from an unheard of problem, is it not? Okay. So it's certainly not something I would rule out. And that would be something you obviously have to go to the physical device for. You know, wireless network interface cards pretty cheap. Okay. You can get them for 10, 15 bucks. Now, would it be a good one for 10 or 15 bucks? I don't know. But it would be a working one for 10 or 15 bucks. Does that make sense? Let's say that everyone is having issues, and there's no issues of interference on the wireless network. What else could it be? It could be a multitude of things. Someone throw me a potential problem. The wired network is working fine. Our wireless is having problems. We don't believe it's interference related. Could it be a bad firmware that we pushed out? Okay. Are firmwares infallible? Have there ever been bad firmwares? Okay. Firmwares with problems like a memory leak. Has that ever existed in history? Yes. Okay. Firmwares with things that break your configuration. Has that ever existed in history? Yes. Could be a bad firmware. Okay. How would you test that? Well, if you just updated the firmware, now nothing's working, you know, try to roll back the firmware. It's pretty easy to do. Maybe do it on a handful of access points first and see if those begin working. If they do, then what should you do? Roll back on everything, right? I think that's pretty self-explanatory. I would hope so. Let's see here. So, could be bad firmware. What about a bad configuration? So that you recently did a configuration update, it's working fine. And then a couple weeks later, you have a little power outage. Okay? A little interruption in power. Everything resets. Okay? Now, if you save the configuration, then it shouldn't be a problem. But let's say you only applied it and you forgot to save it. Okay? Speaking from experience there, that could be a problem you may run into. So what do? Well, you have to rebuild the configuration, you know? Maybe you have a backup that's relatively recent, that's already applied, but you know, if you don't save stuff, you very well could lose everything as soon as power is lost. Does that make sense? So not every enterprise product is like that, by the way. But most of the ones I've used, you save and apply. But you can just apply and not save. Does that make sense? So make sure you're aware of that. Okay. Can anyone think of any other built-in tools, any sort of central problems we may face? Like I said, we've talked about a lot of this already with various things like DHCP problems. You'd be getting APIP addresses. Here's an interesting one. What about duplicate IP addresses? How do we resolve that? So that's certainly one way we could if we had it just an isolated thing. I would say it's a pretty good case to shorten your DHCP lease. So maybe it's 1 week for whatever reason. That's probably a tad long, okay? So shorten your lease, and hopefully that'll resolve it. Maybe you need to expand your IP range. That's certainly possible. Let's say you're on a class B, and you have more than, I think it's what, 16,000 devices or whatever? I don't remember the exact number. I think it's right around 16,000 devices. If you got more than that, then what do you have to do? Maybe you need to move to class A. Okay? So lots of different things to think about there. But like Ben was saying, if you have it on a isolated device, I mean, I would just personally restart the device, because it's a lot easier to tell someone to restart a device than it is to tell them to go into either PowerShell or terminal or command prompt and renew and release their IP address. That's just my opinion. Because let's face it, when you restart, what happens? You're going to get a new DHCP lease, right? Okay. So, again, that's just my opinion. It's not wrong. It's just there's different ways to do things. I would personally do what I think is easier to explain. That's just me. Physical connection test. So they're having some strange problems with corrupted data. Okay, it's not the router. It's not the network interface card that's receiving it. What does that leave? Well, we didn't talk about it. Let's say it's not the switch. Okay, it's not the switch. It's not the network interface card. It's not the router. What is left? Starts with a C. The connection or the cable, one of those two. So you got a big run of cable. Maybe you're using some sort of, let's just say, unshielded twisted pair. You get a kink in the cable. Okay? Can that degrade the signal? Yeah, quite easily. Okay? Could it maybe not visible, or not, I wouldn't say visibly because it's not really visible. Could it not necessarily degrade it at first, but then over time begin to degrade it? That can certainly happen. And could it be degraded but not noticeable until, let's just say, one day, one of the very important twisted pairs snaps? Okay. Then what are you going to have? You have no connection at all, right? Assuming it's one of the 4 that it actually uses. So make sure you keep that in mind. Now, how would you test for that? You guys remember we made the cables in class, in the lab? Okay. Remember that cable tester? Now, I said it's probably about the worst cable tester you can buy that will still work. Okay. You guys understand why? Because that give you any information other than a bunch of flashing lights that tell you whether or not stuff has continuity. Doesn't tell you how long the cable is, doesn't tell you how much interference the cable has. It's not necessarily the best thing in the world, is it? But what did I say about it? It's the cheapest. Okay. The cheapest will tell you if there's no continuity. If there's a break in the cable, it's not going to test appropriately, will it? But it may make sense to have better tools than that if that's something you're doing day in and day out. So you wouldn't be a network administrator doing that, of course. Let's say you're a network engineer. Okay. Putting in the network, you're the physical guy. Okay. Then, obviously, you'd want to have better tools to test that sort of stuff. Fluke makes some pretty good ones. There's probably many others as well. But they're a lot more expensive than the 15 bucks I paid for that kit, aren't they? Okay, so make sure you're aware of that. Toner is going to allow you to isolate a particular cable. So of course the way a toner works is you plug one end into something that's going to generate a tone on the cable, and then you have a sort of listening probe that's going to, basically isolate the cable. You put it up to the cable, and it will emit a tone. Okay, or sometimes it doesn't emit a tone. Sometimes it will instead do things like light up or whatever. So, anyone have a cable toner? That'd be a pretty cool thing to play with, wouldn't it? Okay. So like I said, the main time you're going to use this is if you're inheriting, say, a patch panel or some sort of a very large switched environment that's not labeled appropriately. Okay. So, in general, you're not going to want to just unplug everything and do it manually. You're going to want to tone for it. Does that make sense? Okay, because if you unplug it and you see what goes offline, that could take forever, could it not? Okay, does anyone want to wait forever? I would hope you don't. Now, how do you avoid having to use a cable toner? Okay, pretty straightforward. Label everything. Now, I recommend you use labels that aren't going to be subject to things like UV light degradation. Okay. Because let's say you get labels that are going to degrade in UV light. Okay, then what's going to happen? 5, 10 years down the road when you go to try to read the label. You going to be able to read it? No. Make sure you use UV resistant labels. I recommend using pretty high-end labels. I don't often recommend high-end anything. Labels are important. Okay, high-end labels are still very inexpensive per label. Just saves you a lot of time and troubleshooting down the road. Does that make sense? No. What if you ignore me and get the cheapest labels ever? Okay. You think they'll still work? They might. But I don't see a reason to cheap out on something like that, personally. Maybe you do. I would never tell you what to buy. We talked about cable testers. Let's see. Any other pieces of equipment to test a physical connection we can think of? How about a multimeter? Okay. Can we test stuff with a multimeter? Yeah, we can. Wouldn't necessarily make sense to for most things. But let's say we want to test PoE. Make sure PoE is getting the right voltage and wattage. Could we hypothetically use a multimeter to test that? Is it possible? It's possible. Would it be easy? Ha! Not easy at all, would it? Okay. Most multimeters have, the sort of probing ends, and think about a Cat5 or any of the RJ45 connections. They have very tiny little pins, do they not? Okay. So I'm going to say it's possible to test it with a multimeter, but not easy. Okay, they probably have dedicated testers for that sort of stuff. I've never actually seen them, but think about a dedicated outlet tester. Plug it in. It tells you if you have a ground. It tells you, if the cables are reversed. It tells you lots of information. You just plug it in. They probably have that same sort of thing for PoE. In fact, it's probably existing on the nicer cable testers now that I think about it. Anyone ever used a nicer cable tester before? Do they have PoE tests for the wattage and? It probably exists though. I actually don't know. I probably should have looked up before I lectured about it, but it probably exists on the higher end stuff. And again, that's not something you'd often do. Okay, just being up front. It's something you do in a very rare circumstance. Let's say you had an access point mounted in the ceiling, and it wasn't powering on. So what's the first thing you would do? Okay, the first thing you would do is make sure that it has a connection. Then you'd make sure that it is and when I'm talking about connection, I mean make sure it's plugged in, physically plugged in. Because maybe it's come loose. If it's come loose, plug it in, power's up, you're good to go. Let's say it has that. Okay, so then try it somewhere else. Take the access point down. You're going to have to get up there eventually anyway. and maybe replace it with a tester unit. Tester unit doesn't power up. What does that suggest? Suggests there's either a problem with the cable itself or with the PoE. Okay, it's a problem with the PoE. Maybe you just want to test get a random PoE injector. Okay, and test it with that. If it works with that, and maybe you got a problem with your PoE switch. Maybe it's configured incorrectly, although I don't know if that's possible. You should all negotiate for the right stuff. So, again, could be a lot of problems you may face. Does that make sense? Lastly, wireless test. I think we talked about that already. So, any questions about anything? Like I said, it's a shorter chapter today. We skipped the stuff that there's literally no reason to use in 2021. There's very few reasons to use most of these, just being up front. Most of the time, you're going to get better information from your router and from whatever other central device you have, maybe wireless controller, switch, that sort of thing. That's all I got. Hope you all have a great day. See you Wednesday. See you Friday.